Most people remember Starkiller's story ending one way. He stood in front of the Emperor on the Death Star, threw himself into a wave of force lightning to save his friends, and died burning out in the most powerful act of self-sacrifice his life had ever produced. That is one version of how it ended. There is another. In the second, Galen Marek does not save his friends. He kills the master who had broken him his whole life, walks into the Emperor's throne room with revenge in his hands, and tries to kill the man who had ordered his life destroyed. He fails. The Emperor was waiting for exactly that move, and what Palpatine does to him next is the part of the story the casual telling almost never reaches. He gets crushed under his own ship. The Emperor uses the Force to summon the Rogue Shadow through the viewport of the Death Star and drops the vessel directly on top of him. By the time the Imperial droids pull what is left of Galen out of the wreckage, his body is worse than Vader's had ever been. His lower half is gone, his lungs crushed, and every bone in his body is broken. He's closer to the state Grievous was in when Dooku found him than to anything Vader had survived. He is a Force-sensitive corpse with a heartbeat, and Palpatine has just the project for him. For thousands of years, the Sith ran a separate caste of operatives most of the galaxy never knew existed. They were not warriors, they were not apprentices, they were assassins, trained on a different planet from the rest of the Order, taught to vanish in plain sight, taught to kill Jedi from the shadows rather than face them in open combat. They wore personal cloaking devices that erased them from sight when they were not fighting. Almost no record of their work survived because the Jedi who encountered them rarely survived to write the report. The most refined version of those assassins was something the old Sith called the Stalker. The Sith Lords of the ancient era looked at their best killers and decided they were not enough. The bodies could be improved. Force sensitivity could be channeled through cybernetic upgrades calibrated specifically for Force users, in ways no Republic or Separatist engineer had ever attempted. The result was not a soldier in armor. The armor itself was not even worn. It was grafted directly onto the flesh and bone of the host. Painful, permanent, and irreversible. The Stalker did not put the suit on. The suit became the body. The knowledge of how to build one of these warriors was lost to history long before the Empire existed. When Palpatine designed Vader's suit, he did not have access to the Stalker tradition. He built Vader on the framework of Grievous instead, which is why Vader ended up with the limitations he did. No fingers free of Force lightning, breathing on automation, movement restricted, and a control panel built into the front of the chest plate where any enemy could see it. Palpatine considered Vader his minor masterpiece, but Vader was also a compromise. By the time Galen Marek's broken body reached the Emperor's operating table, that compromise had been solved. Palpatine had spent the years since building Vader recovering Sith knowledge from sources Vader was never allowed to see. He had found the Stalker tradition, he learned how the armor was grafted, how the cybernetics interface with a Force user's connection, how to build a body that did not fight against its own power. He had a perfect candidate lying in front of him, already destroyed enough to require complete reconstruction. What he built was everything Vader was supposed to have been. The hands stayed organic enough at the fingers to channel Force lightning, with claws that conducted the discharge outward instead of letting it backfire into the suit. The breathing apparatus connected to the crushed lungs, but the controls sat hidden inside the chest where no one could see them. The user, not the suit, decided the breathing rate. Combat movement was unrestricted. The lightsaber form Galen had learned in his old life still worked, because nothing about the new body forced him to abandon it. The Stalker version of Starkiller kept everything that had made him terrifying, and added everything Vader had been denied. What was missing from the new Galen was the part of him that ever belonged to himself. The original Stalkers were not apprentices. They were never meant to inherit anything. They had no philosophy and no future beyond the missions assigned to them. They were weapons in the most complete sense the Sith had ever produced. Under the suit, by every account that survived, they were silent. They did not negotiate or bargain. They walked through Jedi formations like something the Force had stopped paying attention to and cut down everything in their path. That is what Galen Marek becomes in the darker version of events. A man who got his revenge, lost everything else, and woke up inside a body Palpatine had been planning to build since long before the Empire existed. The Sith Stalker tradition reached forward from the deep past and found its first new host in 1,000 years. Palpatine, who once said he would have built Vader again with zeal if he had the chance, got something better instead. He got a second crack at his minor masterpiece With all the knowledge the original project had been missing, Starkiller's life has two endings, a quiet one in the light, and a much darker one most retellings skip. The Sith Stalker tradition is one of the buried details the saga rarely surfaces. The galaxy is full of them, old experiments, lost techniques, Sith Lords whose names the Jedi should have remembered and didn't. The Council Chamber doors are not built to fail. For centuries, on a planet at the center of galactic civilization, those doors had separated the Jedi Order's leadership from everything else, and the Order had stopped imagining the day they would not hold. In the novel The Old Republic, Deceived, by Paul S. Kemp, that day arrives. A figure in dark armor moves through the Jedi Temple on Coruscant with an intent that is not improvised. He does not stop at the entrance or pause to take in the building. The novel describes the destruction of the Sith Empire's campaign as carried out in his wake. The violence does not surround him or carry him forward. It follows him because he's the source. His name is Darth Malgus. The Jedi Council that meets above him does not know it yet, but the figure climbing towards them is not like the Sith they have spent generations preparing for. Something about him does not fit the way those Sith were supposed to behave. When that day is over, the council that walks out will no longer trust what it knows, and the unease that begins inside the temple will stay with the Order for the rest of his lifetime. Thousands of years from this moment, long after the Republic he's about to break has reformed and fallen again, two of the most powerful Sith in galactic history will still keep a text written by the man inside their building on their shelves. According to the Legends reference book, Book of Sith, a collection assembled by Darth Sidious, one of the included works is a text by Darth Malgus, and the same volume is later annotated by Darth Vader. Inside the temple, one detail had not yet registered. The Sith walking towards the council was not behaving like a Sith. The Jedi have been hunting Sith for generations. The Star Wars The Old Republic historian Nostaral records that the council had even ordered him to revise the Order's historical records and trace the conflict with the Sith back to its roots. That kind of long memory was the Order's pride. It meant a Jedi Master meeting a new Sith threat could compare what they were seeing against centuries of patterns the Order had already studied, and most of the time, the new Sith fits somewhere inside those patterns. A rage-driven Sith looked one way, and a court politician Sith looked at another. The Order had a category for both, and weaknesses to read in each. The figure in the temple does not fit either profile. The Jedi inside the building during the sacking are not facing a berserker losing control. They're not facing a court climber striking at a rival. They're facing a commander, methodical, in his place at the front of the violence rather than carried along by it. Soldiers move around him with a discipline that is not the Imperial standard. Some of them are not even from species the Empire trusts. That last detail, easy to miss in the noise of the assault, is the first crack in the Jedi's profile of him. The official Old Republic record of him says it plainly. He employed mercenaries drawn from species long considered untrustworthy by Imperial custom. Imperial doctrine treated whole populations as unreliable in principle, and most Sith of his rank accepted those prejudices without question. He did not. The fighters in the temple that day included people the rest of the Empire would never have armed. That detail alone would later tell the Order something. Sith who go against Imperial doctrine on a question that is fundamental are not Sith working their way up a ladder. They're Sith building their own thing, and they've already decided the ladder is in the way. The Jedi do not have time to study him that day. The temple falls, and the Order survives. The figure in the dark armor leaves Coruscant alive, and the Republic, in what the Star Wars The Old Republic galactic history entry on the Treaty of Coruscant calls a peace agreement, unprecedented in Republic history, signs the deal. The Republic does not want it, and the records are direct about that. The same Star Wars The Old Republic material adds that the Jedi Council urged caution when the Senate considered the Sith offer, and even the Council had to admit the war had become unwinnable. That is the first thing he takes from the Order, their voice. The Jedi who had served the Republic for millennia are now the ones in the chamber telling the senators to step back. They feel the change before they can name it. The quiet fear that the Sith who had reached the temple had also reached the part of them that used to know what to say. The masters who had once carried the Republic's hardest decisions through the Senate floor now spoke in shorter sentences and gave way faster, because the certainty that had once carried them into the room had not walked in with them. The treaty is signed, the war ends, and the Sith who had shaped both walks out of Coruscant alive with years of work ahead of him that nobody is yet equipped to watch. the Old Republic record of his career picks up the story. He leads military expeditions into the unknown regions after the war, expanding the Empire's influence through that work. In the Old Republic era, the unknown regions are the uncharted edge of the galaxy, a zone where star maps run out and where no major power holds firm control. The Jedi have intelligence networks across the galaxy. They do not have them out there, and for years, that is where he goes. The fear that grows inside the Order during these years is not the fear of a Sith they can find, it is the fear of a Sith they cannot, and the Jedi had never had to live with that kind of fear from any Sith before him. The choice was a rejection of every path Sith of his rank were supposed to take. The campaigns are slow, the political capital is harder to claim from a Senate that does not know where the territory is. A Sith who wants to climb the Imperial Pyramid spends those years in the capital, attending court functions, cultivating Dark Counselors, trading favors, managing apprentices. Armies come through assignment, and titles come through patronage. Removing a Sith of his rank from the hierarchy is often as simple as removing the patron above him. He refuses all of it. The official record of his career shows no patron, no faction, and no steady court presence around him after the treaty. His support base comes from those unknown regions campaigns, not from court alliances. The soldiers under his command have not been assigned to him by a court order. They follow him because they followed him into places nobody else was willing to go. The same record notes, almost in passing, that he personally learns dozens of languages. That detail is strange when read alone, because a rage-driven Sith does not sit still long enough to learn dozens of languages. That kind of work takes years. It is the work of someone who plans to govern populations, not just break them. When the Jedi tried to map him the way they always had, looking for a patron, a political circle, or an apprentice chain, they found that none of those connections existed in any form they could follow. There was no relationship to pressure, no faction to infiltrate, and no pattern that could tell them what he would do next. The file they built on him gave them nothing to hold on to. The mercenaries under his command did not appear in Imperial records the way regular Sith forces would, and the territory he operated in did not exist on the Order's maps. Over time, that absence began to change how the Order spoke about him. Briefings stopped ending with conclusions and began to focus on contingencies, on what the Order might do if he moved next, and how little of that they could actually control. Somewhere during those same years, he was also writing. The Order did not know that yet, and the Empire did not know it either, but the text Sidious would one day collect was already taking shape, and the Sith who was writing it had stopped thinking of himself as Imperial. The next time the Emperor heard from him publicly, he was no longer serving it. The revolt, when it came, was not a court intrigue. A later Star Wars The Old Republic storyline historical recap describes him as long dissatisfied with Imperial backstabbing and political maneuvering, and as eventually leading a revolt of his own, aiming to seize control of the Sith Empire. He believed Imperial politics was weakening the Sith cause. He believed internal betrayals wasted energy that should have been aimed outward. He had said none of this loudly enough for the court to register it as a threat. The strange part is what came before. The Empire had spent decades with him in plain view. The sacking of Coruscant was on his record, and the Unknown Regions campaigns were in the Imperial files. The mercenaries, the languages, the absence of patronage, all of it was on paper. None of it had alarmed the people the Empire trusted to watch for ambitious Sith. In Imperial offices, his file was kept on a desk that handled minor warlords, because there was no court intrigue to track. In Jedi briefings, his name came up less often each year, because there was no faction movement to report. Both institutions had quietly decided he was no longer the priority he had been, and both were wrong. The Imperial Court ran on the assumption that ambitious Sith expressed their ambition inside it. A Sith with no court footprint was, by the Empire's own logic, a Sith with no ambition worth watching. That assumption was wrong. The court had no framework for someone whose ambition operated outside the framework entirely. When the revolt arrives, the Star Wars The Old Republic storyline record describes it as an open move. He gathers the forces he had built during his years in the Unknown Regions, the same kind of troops and mercenaries documented in his record, and turns them toward the existing Imperial leadership. The revolt is not a cabal trying to replace one Dark Counselor with another. It is a direct challenge to the shape of the Empire itself, launched by a commander who already has an army that answers to him personally before the first shot is fired. For the Jedi watching the news come in, The revolt confirmed something they had been afraid of without proof for years, that the Sith they could not see had been preparing on a scale the Order had no vocabulary for. Inside the Jedi Order, the pieces finally clicked together. The masters who had spent years trying to read him as one kind of Sith now understood, all at once, that they had been reading the wrong book. The fear they had been carrying without a name became a fear they could finally see. It was worse named. From that day, Council decisions came slower. Every assessment of a Sith threat now had to pass through masters who knew their last reading had been wrong, and the certainty that it once carried Jedi into Republic chambers did not come back. The Council had been carrying questions about him since the sacking. The pieces had been there for years, but the frame had not been there to fit them. The revolt provides the frame. The Jedi had not been looking at a Sith warlord building his own career, they'd been looking at a Sith quietly building his own replacement for the entire Imperial system. Other Sith who resented Imperial weakness had spent their careers inside the system they wanted to change, which meant every move they made could be traced through their own networks and blocked. Malgus had given the Empire no thread to pull on him. He had given the Jedi no threat either. Late in his career, both institutions finally understood what he was. They also understood, at the same moment, that they had been late to understand him for the entire time he had been alive. Even that late understanding was not the end of the problem, and the revolt did not end his story. The Old Republic record of him covers his continuing campaigns into the unknown regions, years of them. The later Star Wars The Old Republic storyline material places the revolt as a separate major event. Later, the Old Republic story pages describe him pursuing an unknown plan inside storylines that come later still. A Republic that hopes to close the file on him keeps finding the file does not close. The sources never call him unbeatable, they describe something more dangerous than that. He is defeatable in combat, and his plans can be opposed. What he has instead is durability. A Republic that wins a fight against him in one era finds him operating under different rules in the next, and nothing they learned in the previous phase fully carries forward. For Jedi intelligence teams trying to keep a profile current, every read on him kept going stale. A Jedi analyst could close a file on him at the end of one decade and find, opening it in the next, that the figure inside it had moved past every assumption the file was built on. The sacking gave the Order a Sith who could reach the temple, and they prepared for that. The Unknown Regions years gave them a Sith who could operate beyond their maps, and they prepared for that. The Revolt gave them a Sith who could split the Empire from inside, and they prepared for that. The later storylines gave them a Sith pursuing an unknown plan that nobody had a vocabulary for yet, and they understood, finally, that whatever they prepared for would be the wrong thing again. Most Sith of the era are understood inside a single arc and then shelved. He kept forcing new understandings every time anyone thought they had him figured out, and during all of this, the writing he had started somewhere in the Unknown Regions years was still in the world. Thousands of years passed, and the Republic he broke reforms and fell again. The Sith Empire that produced him collapses long before his name leaves official record. New Sith rise, new Jedi rise, whole eras pass between his lifetime and the next time the galaxy will be ruled from the chair he had once tried to take. Eventually, in a private collection assembled by the Sith Lord, who had just won that chair, a text by Darth Malgus is filed alongside writings from other Sith deemed worth preserving. The collector is Darth Sidious. The collection is the volume identified in Legends as Book of Sith, and Sidious selects what goes into it. Later, that same volume is annotated by Darth Vader. These two figures are not casual readers. They are the most powerful Sith in galactic history. Sidious will rule the galaxy, and Vader will enforce that rule. Their attention is finite, and the things that hold it tend to be the things they consider worth their attention. The fact that a Sith from the Old Republic, dead for thousands of years by then, is on that shelf is the kind of detail that ought to be impossible. What exactly Malgus put into that text, the sources do not fully say, but his career points at the kind of thinking Sidious and Vader were reading. The Sith philosophy of Malgus's era was dominated by the internal games of the Imperial Court, by lineage and patronage, by Sith who defined themselves through the system around them. Malgus built his life against that grain. He had hired outside Imperial prejudice. He had expanded into territory the Empire's own maps did not cover. He had led through combat rather than through court rank. He had revolted against the Empire that produced him when he judged it no longer worth serving. Whatever went into his book of Sith texts almost certainly reflected that worldview. A Sith who argued that power belonged to the one who built it directly, not to the one who climbed for it, and who would ultimately prove the argument with his career. That is the kind of reading material a Sith Lord like Sidious would preserve. It is also the kind of reading material a figure like Vader would keep going back to, because the idea at its center was a model for how to be Sith without being owned by the structures the Sith had built around themselves. The Jedi's failure to ever solve him had now stopped being a wartime problem and become a permanent one. The Order had spent his lifetime trying to pressure him through structures he refused to use, trying to track him through networks he refused to join, trying to read him through patterns he did not fit. They had never found a way through, and the years they spent trying produced a fear inside the Order that no other Sith of any era had matched, because no other Sith had stayed unreachable for as long as he had. And then, he was gone. And the writing stayed, and the most dangerous Sith of the next era, and the era after that, took it down off the shelf and read it. The fear the Order carried about him was never about his lightsaber. It came from something they could not reach, a Sith who did not respond to any of their methods, and whose next move they could not read. Every other Sith they had faced could be answered in some way, but with Malgus, none of these answers held. And even when he was gone, the uncertainty he left behind never fully disappeared. The Jedi spent a Sith's entire lifetime trying to predict him, and failed. The Order's caution had always been about prediction. Long before the sacking of Coruscant, they had drawn a line around two species they refused to recruit. No matter how strong a candidate's connection to the Force, and the reason for that line, says something about how the Jedi understood the dark side.
The secret behind why the Jedi never appear to have recruited Sith purebloods and Rakata reveals something deeper about how the Order protected the galaxy from the dark side's influence. Pulling from 4 Legends continuity sources, Star Wars Tales of the Jedi Companion, The Old Republic, Revan, The Knights of the Old Republic Campaign Guide, and Darth Bane, Path of Destruction, we break down 10 reasons that made it virtually impossible for these two species to ever appear within the Jedi Order, even with their inherent Force connection. The first reason the Jedi never recruited from these species stems from their fundamental opposition to Jedi principles. What made Sith purebloods different was that they weren't just another Force-sensitive species. Their entire biology pulled them toward the dark side like a magnet pulls iron. For the Sith species, this wasn't a temptation, but their very nature. The Jedi way devoted itself to mastering the light side of the Force, and was built on controlling emotions, embracing peace, and seeking knowledge and serenity, while turning from passion and chaos. In direct contrast, the dark side was described as actively drawing the wicked, evil, the weak-willed, and the power-hungry into its grasp. It offered self-gain, egoism, and convenience, directly crossing the boundary that the Jedi maintained with absolute dedication. Both the Kashyyyk and Massassi, the two primary subspecies that originated from the Sith homeworld of Korriban, were generally seen as being strong in the dark side of the Force. This wasn't learned behavior or cultural influence alone. Their blood carried the legacy of dozens of millennia of dark side evolution. The vast knowledge and ancient Sith techniques were preserved within their massive temples and structures, passed down through generations of pure Sith blood. Within Sith society, Force sensitivity marked the elite. Those blessed with the Force rose above the lower ranks of Imperial society, which was built entirely on the foundation of the dark side. But the reality behind this is far more unsettling. In Sith society, a pureblood born without any connection to the Force was considered an abomination, an existence that, by tradition, could not be allowed to continue. This cultural practice had profound implications for the Jedi. Any Sith pureblood who lived long enough to be considered for recruitment had already been shaped by a civilization that eliminated those who could not embrace the dark side. Their survival alone meant that they had been raised within a worldview defined by brutality, power, and fear, making them fundamentally incompatible with the principles of the Jedi Order. Another reason centers on how inherently dangerous the dark side itself was by nature. The lore of the dark side was characterized as powerful and dangerously easy to rush into, tempting even the strong. Individuals were warned against a tendency to seek the easy path to power, as empowering such weak souls could lead to dangerous consequences. Training Force sensitives meant constantly watching for those who lacked the will to resist the dark side's temptations. That path didn't offer a gradual descent, but a cliff edge that even strong-willed individuals could stumble over in moments of weakness or desperation. For a species that had no cultural or biological resistance to that pull, the danger multiplied exponentially. Among all Sith subspecies, the Massassi embodied everything the Jedi stood against. They were fearsome, ruthless, and efficient soldiers who lacked respect for Jedi or Republic standards. Their violent and ruthless nature wasn't something that could be trained away. It was woven into who they were as a people. The Massassi had been bred and shaped over countless generations to serve as warriors for the Sith Lords, and that purpose had become inseparable from their identity. They maintained their traditional military organization and weapons systems, rather than adopting any philosophies that contradicted their warrior heritage. Meanwhile, the Jedi Order devoted itself to mastering the light side through controlling emotions, embracing peace, and seeking knowledge and serenity. The dark side offered the exact opposite: self-gain, egoism, and convenience. These paths didn't just diverge, but opposed each other at every fundamental level. Jedi Masters understood this threat intimately. They made efforts to destroy Sith talismans specifically to prevent them from falling into the hands of uninitiated Force users or power-hungry dark side followers. The third reason centers on the deep connection to Sith power and lore that the species maintained. Sith teachings that came back to the galaxy were purposefully aimed at power-hungry individuals. The deep connection of the Sith species to the dark side was shown in the discovery that the vast knowledge and evolution of ancient Sith techniques derived from pure Sith blood over dozens of millennia were preserved within their massive structures and temples. The legacy remained alive in every stone they laid, every generation born, and every memory passed down across lifespans that most galactic powers couldn't match. Training Force sensitives required constantly watching for those who lacked the will to resist the dark side's temptations. But the Sith species had evolved over millennia without building that resistance. They had built temples to its power instead. Every stone in those temples had been laid by hands guided by dark side philosophy, and every technique preserved within them had been refined through generations of practitioners who saw the dark side not as corruption, but as the natural order of power. Fourth on the list was the Jedi's recruitment vetting process, which was meticulous by necessity. The Jedi required careful monitoring of all potential recruits, especially apprentices, to ensure they did not seek out the quick, seductive, and corrupting advantages of the dark side. As a rule, rather than an absolute law, the Jedi avoided recruiting individuals already steeped in dark side traditions. They had to devote their training to the light side, as a person who committed to the dark side lost their innate self and became immersed in the dark, suffering penalties that fundamentally changed who they were. And the Jedi had good reasons for maintaining such strict standards. Centuries of experience had taught them that Force training could turn dangerous faster than anyone expected. Every apprentice was constantly monitored for signs of dark side temptation, while masters devoted years to training each Padawan, watching for weakness and nurturing strength. This system worked because it started with candidates who had a genuine chance of succeeding. Starting with Sith purebloods would be like building a house on quicksand, where the foundation was wrong from the beginning. This empire had been built by Darksiders who fled after suffering defeat in an ancient civil war against the Jedi, and they dedicated their new society to ruling through ambition and strength. Jedi philosophy had always warned that ambition led inevitably to the dark side of the Force, and the entire Sith civilization validated these warnings through their actions. Fifth on the list of reasons preventing their recruitment was the fundamental opposition and ideological divide between these civilizations. Sith society represented a civilization built on ruling through ambition, the very trait that Jedi teachings warned led directly to the dark side of the Force. By contrast, the Jedi were the Republic's guardians, charged with the responsibility of keeping the peace throughout known space, making conflict inevitable when confronted with an empire built entirely on opposing principles, making conflict not just possible, but inevitable. These weren't minor skirmishes or border disputes. These were existential struggles that shaped galactic history and cost millions of lives on both sides. After the Great Hyperspace War, the Sith species vanished from Republic space for over 1,000 years. They existed in separate, hostile spheres from the Jedi and the Republic. When a Sith pureblood finally appeared in Republic territory, their physical features made them immediately identifiable. Red skin and dangling cheek tendrils marked them as clearly as a uniform. Any Jedi who encountered one would recognize them instantly as members of the enemy civilization, especially since their presence in Republic space had been absent for over 1,000 years. How could the Jedi recruit from a species that saw them as ancient enemies? That ideological gap was too wide, and the historical blood between them ran too deep, and the ongoing war made any attempt at recruitment not just impossible, but potentially a betrayal of the Republic the Jedi served. As a seventh reason, the exiled history of the Sith civilization created a gap that could never be crossed. Defeated Darksiders had fled the Republic to build their own civilization, forming what became the Sith Empire. When Jedi Master Revan investigated the Sith Empire, he learned that the Sith species had vanished from Republic space after the Great Hyperspace War, indicating the two factions existed in separate, hostile spheres. This wasn't a peaceful separation or cultural divergence, but the result of war, exile, and centuries of animosity that had hardened into absolute opposition. Darksiders who founded the Sith Empire hadn't left seeking a new path. They had fled after defeat, carrying their hatred with them and building a civilization designed to oppose everything the Jedi represented. On the other hand, the Rakata presented a completely different problem, one that went beyond ideology or culture. These ancient builders of the Infinite Empire had lost their connection to the Force itself. The eighth reason applies specifically to the Rakata and centers on their Force blindness. The Rakata possessed the Force-blind species trait, meaning they had lost their connection to the Force. Their extinction was not caused by the destruction of the Starforge. According to Darth Bane, Path of Destruction, the Rakata were already on the verge of extinction when Revan discovered them, and their tiny population could no longer sustain a viable gene pool. The Starforge's destruction shut down the Temple's defenses and contributed to Lihan's isolation. But the gene pool collapse is the canon reason the species died out. This fundamental biological limitation prevented them from taking the Force sensitivity feat, which meant they could not be trained as traditional Jedi. Training someone in the Force became impossible when they could no longer sense or access it. The Rakata had once wielded the Force to build an empire that spanned the galaxy, but the loss of the Starforge severed that connection permanently. In the distant past, the Rakata had been darkside Force users, but by the era covered in our sources, they were entirely Force blind. No meditation technique or training regimen could restore what was no longer there. This wasn't a matter of weak connection or untrained potential. The connection was simply gone, lost at a level so fundamental that it became a defining trait of the species itself. This Force-blind trait wasn't temporary or conditional, but absolute. Where other species might have individuals with varying degrees of Force sensitivity, every Rakata shared this same limitation. The Jedi could no more train a Rakata in the Force than they could teach a blind person to see through meditation alone. But even if the Rakata could somehow regain their Force connection, their culture posed serious obstacles. The ninth reason involves the violent culture and rage that characterized Rakata society. Rakata culture was noted for its violence and primitive nature. They possessed a species trait linked to rage, allowing them to enter a rage once per day as a swift action. This wasn't a matter of individual temperament or poor socialization. The capacity for rage was built into their biology as surely as their Force blindness was. A species trait that allowed for entering a rage state represented the opposite of everything Jedi training aimed to achieve. 10th on the list was the difficulty in recruitment and integration that the Rakata presented. Few outsiders survived visiting the Rakata homeworld of Lehon, and the species remained mostly unfamiliar with Republic laws and systems. Although a few Rakata adventurers existed in a wider galaxy, they were rarely scouts or nobles. Sometimes they appeared as Force users, but the explicit Force-blind trait listed in their species statistics prevented any potential for proper Jedi training and made their suitability for the Jedi Order impossible. As a general rule, the Jedi Order avoided recruiting Force-sensitive individuals who were perceived as dangerous, or those who were likely to be swayed to the dark side. Even without the Force-blind limitation, the Rakata's violent culture and rage-fueled nature would have made them poor candidates for an order built on peace and emotional control. Their entire cultural history was built on conquering and controlling others through the Force. Even after losing that connection, the patterns of violence and rage remained. These weren't behaviors that could be easily unlearned or suppressed through Jedi training, but fundamental aspects of how Rakata society functioned. The Jedi didn't recruit randomly from Force-sensitive populations across the galaxy. They followed careful guidelines developed over thousands of years of experience. They specifically did not recruit individuals who practiced traditions like those of the Sith, which relied heavily on the dark side. They avoided those who seemed controlling, dangerous, or likely to fall. This philosophy made perfect sense when you understood what was at stake. Every Jedi trained represented a potential weapon for either the light or the dark. A fallen Jedi didn't just lose their way, they became active threats to everything the Order protected. The galaxy had seen too many examples of powerful Force users who turned to the dark side and caused massive destruction. The evaluation was simple. The risks dramatically outweighed the uncertain potential gains. Even if a single Sith pureblood could somehow resist their nature, their culture, and their history, they would face impossible obstacles within the Jedi Order itself. The Rakata failed an even more basic test. They lacked the fundamental requirement for Jedi training. Anger control could theoretically be taught through discipline and training. However, no amount of instruction could grant access to a power that existed beyond their biological reach. The Rakata represented a cautionary tale about what happened when a species misused the Force so thoroughly that the Force itself seemed to withdraw from them. Whether their Force blindness was a natural consequence of their actions or some kind of cosmic punishment remained unknown, but the result was the same. The books make it clear that the Jedi faced an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, how a species was born determined everything. The Sith species had evolved over dozens of millennia in an environment saturated with the dark side. Their temples and structures preserved ancient knowledge passed through pure Sith blood. This wasn't about individual choice or free will. This was about a species whose very genetic code had been shaped by dark side energy for longer than most civilizations existed. Both species demonstrated that the relationship between biology, culture, and the Force was more complex than simple individual choice could account for. The Jedi Order's refusal to recruit from these species reveals something important about how they viewed their mission. They weren't trying to save every Force-sensitive being in the galaxy. They were trying to protect the galaxy itself from the threat of dark side corruption spreading through their own ranks. The Jedi understood that they couldn't fix everything or save everyone. From the Jedi's perspective, the most compassionate choice was to recognize when individuals seemed fundamentally unsuited for their path rather than subject them to what appeared to be inevitable failure and pain. Both represented impossible challenges for an order that already struggled to maintain its numbers and its principles in a galaxy that constantly tested both. The Jedi made their choice based on practical necessity as much as philosophical conviction. They chose to work with species that offered a real chance of success rather than spending their limited resources on cases that seemed doomed from the start.
The Jedi spent millennia refusing to let certain beings into their order because the cost of getting it wrong was too high. The Separatists took the opposite approach. They manufactured their soldiers cheap, programmed them simple, and treated the consequences as everyone else's problem. The B-1 battle droid chatter that became the running joke of the Clone Wars was not personality, it was the sound of a system failing.
B-1 battle droids were never designed to have personality. Yet, all that chatter, the confused observations, the running commentary mid-battle, made them iconic. None of it was programmed, but Canon and Legends sources reveal the real cause behind the talking, and it's far darker than comic relief. The story begins in the factories of Bactoid Combat Automata, long before the Clone Wars. The Legends reference book, The Essential Guide to Warfare, explains that the Trade Federation, a powerful commerce guild that controlled shipping lanes across the galaxy, originally commissioned B-1 units for a simple purpose: protecting cargo ships from pirates. The design specifications reflected this limited role, with Bactoid engineers building the droids using cheap cognitive modules, essentially their computer brains, along with basic sensors and thin armor. These were meant to be throwaway security guards, not real soldiers, and the Trade Federation's well-known cheapness ensured low-quality construction from the start. However, the cheap construction was not just about cutting costs. The Neimoidians who ran the Federation had specific reasons for choosing droids over living soldiers. The canon reference book Attack of the Clones: The Visual Dictionary describes them as too fearful to fight their own battles, and too paranoid to trust living soldiers with weapons that might be turned against them. Battle droids solved both problems: mindlessly loyal, completely obedient, and endlessly replaceable. If 1,000 were destroyed, the Federation simply ordered more without any of the costs that came with living troops. This throwaway mindset extended even to the physical design. Bactoid engineers built the battle droids to look like Geonosians, the insect-like species whose factories would later produce B-1s by the billions. Neimoidian crew members spread rumors that the droids' long faces were modeled after Neimoidian skulls as some kind of death symbol, but that was just a story. The B-1s simply looked like the workers who built them. By 32 BBY, the Trade Federation was ready to test its droid army. When they blockaded the planet Naboo, their B-1 forces operated under the direction of a massive ship called the Vutun Pala. This is what the Federation called a droid control ship, essentially a flying supercomputer that controlled every battle droid on the planet below. The canon reference book Star Wars Complete Vehicles details this vessel, which measured over 3,000 meters across and contained huge transmitters, antennas, and extra power generators to run them all. At its center was the Control Brain Network, which sent signals to every battle droid telling them exactly what to do. The ship also carried up to 1,500 Vulture droids, automated starfighters that could swarm enemy vessels, along with landing craft, tanks, and troop transports for the ground invasion. The system worked simply, but it had a critical flaw. One massive computer coordinated hundreds of thousands of droids at once, sending commands that each B-1 would follow without thinking. Individual droids needed almost no processing power, because all the thinking happened on the ship above. This made each droid very cheap to build, but it also meant the entire army depended on a single point of failure. The control signals directed each droid's actions, making up for what engineers described as the very limited onboard logic systems of the minimalist droids. Without this constant signal and its stabilizing carrier wave, the droids would become completely useless. The canon reference book Complete Vehicles refers to the droids as terminals, not soldiers, not even machines in the full sense, just receiving equipment that could not act on its own. The B-1s could not handle any tactic more complicated than walking forward and shooting. Anything beyond that had to come from the control ship, and without that computer, they were nothing. The disaster at Naboo proved exactly how dangerous this weakness could be. In the 1990 film The Phantom Menace, young Anakin Skywalker fired torpedoes into the droid control ship's reactor and destroyed it. The explosion did not just destroy one ship, it shut down the Federation's entire army in an instant. Every battle droid on the planet went into sleep mode, and Gungan warriors, the amphibious natives who had been fighting for their lives moments before, started kicking motionless droids across the battlefield. The Federation's entire invasion force had been beaten by destroying a single ship. As a result, the Trade Federation ordered a major change. Their B-1 units would be upgraded with better cognitive modules that allowed independent thought, which would prevent the mass shutdowns that had destroyed their invasion force. Canon sources note that the new B-1 battle droids no longer needed a control ship signal and could operate on their own. On paper, it seemed like a smart fix to an obvious design flaw. In practice, however, this decision made everything worse. Making B-1s genuinely intelligent would have cost too much money. The same corporate mindset that chose droids over living soldiers because of cost had no intention of spending serious credits on brain upgrades. For comparison, super battle droids, the heavily armored B-2 models built after Naboo, cost 200 times as much as a standard B-1. Droidicas, the rolling destroyer droids with shields and twin cannons, cost over 200 times more than a B-1 as well. The Federation paid for specialized units when specific jobs required them, but the B-1 was supposed to be produced in huge numbers. Consequently, real upgrades were not worth the expense. The irony was that even the more expensive droids had embarrassing limitations. The Legends reference book, The Essential Guide to Warfare, describes how B-2 super battle droids, despite costing 200 times more than a standard B-1, came with their own problems. The B-2s would plod directly into firefights, sometimes physically shoving other battle droids aside without the slightest concern for tactics or self-preservation. Their programming prioritized forward aggression over any kind of strategic thinking. Even worse, the same source notes that B-2s sometimes deleted enemies who moved out of visual range from their targeting modules. If a Republic soldier ducked behind cover and stayed there long enough, the super battle droid might simply forget they existed and move on to another target. The machines could not track threats they could not immediately see. More money bought better armor and bigger weapons, but it never bought genuine intelligence. Instead of building better droids, the Separatists stuffed new programming into old hardware. About 10 years after Naboo, the Clone Wars began. The Separatists were the faction that broke away from the Republic, using droid armies supplied by the Trade Federation and other corporate allies. Throughout the war, they pushed their upgraded B-1s even further by reprogramming them to work as pilots, gunners, damage control teams, security guards, and communications operators. These were jobs the droids were never designed to do, and the results showed. This attitude extended to the entire military structure. According to the Essential Guide to Warfare, a squad had 8 battle droids with no leader because units were either remote-controlled or pre-programmed before battle. A platoon had 7 squads, a company had 2 platoons transported via multi-troop transports, and the numbers kept growing into battalions, regiments, divisions, and full armies. A single Lucrehulk battleship could carry an entire army of over 200,000 battle droids, and no single unit mattered. The whole system was designed to absorb losses that would have destroyed any army of living soldiers. While organic squads were led by sergeants, droid squads needed no officer at all. They were simply pointed at the enemy and told to march. Clone troopers, the Republic soldiers fighting against the droids, called them clankers and destroyed them by the dozens in every battle. The Legends novel Republic Commando: Hard Contact shows clone troopers treating battle droids with casual disrespect, viewing them as target practice rather than real enemies. From a military view, this made sense. The droids were bad shots with weak sensors and computer brains that could barely follow basic orders. Republic forces developed fighting methods specifically designed to exploit these weaknesses, and a single trained clone could destroy many battle droids without much difficulty. But the contempt went deeper than just tactical superiority. To the clones, droids were not real warriors with pride and honor, just metal targets that happened to shoot back. In the novel, one clone reflects that droids did not even have the sense to be scared, which made fighting them feel almost hollow. There was no satisfaction in defeating an enemy that did not understand it was losing. Another passage describes how droids were great on open battlefields, but useless for anything requiring judgment or adaptation. They could follow orders, but they could not think about whether those orders made sense. The clones also noticed specific weaknesses that made droids frustrating to fight. According to the same novel, B-1s were particularly poor in dense forests and complex terrain, where their limited processors could not adapt to unpredictable environments. When situations changed unexpectedly, they simply repeated whatever behavior their last command had instructed. In close quarters combat, droids performed especially badly without direction from what clones called a wet, their slang for organic officers. A firefight that would challenge living soldiers for hours might only last minutes against droids because the machines could not improvise. This created a strange dynamic on the battlefield. Clone troopers were fighting an enemy that vastly outnumbered them, but could barely function as soldiers. The droids marched forward, fired their weapons, and died in huge numbers, while the clones adapted, flanked, and exploited every limitation. The war was not a contest between equals, but trained soldiers grinding through waves of malfunctioning equipment. What the clones witnessed on battlefields across the galaxy was not just poor design, it was a system failure happening in real time. The Legends reference book, The Essential Guide to Warfare, documents what Separatist commanders discovered early in the war. Standard maintenance routines, the computer cleanup procedures that were supposed to keep droids working properly, actually erased the B-1 specialty programming. A droid trained to fly a ship would forget everything after a maintenance cycle. Everything the droids had learned since their last checkup would simply disappear, meaning the process meant to keep them functional destroyed the very upgrades keeping them useful. The solution was to skip maintenance entirely. The droids kept working on the surface, following basic commands and marching where ordered. But underneath, their cognitive modules started collecting damage that would never be fixed. Bad data piled up, processing slowed down, and systems designed for simple tasks strained under work they were never meant to handle. As a result, B-1 cognitive modules developed errors at increasing rates. Some droids shut down completely when their processors got overwhelmed by junk data. Others developed what reports called behavioral problems, freezing at critical moments, repeating the same action without finishing it, or responding to orders with outputs that made no sense. The most common symptom was talking. This is where the Essential Guide to Warfare provides the key explanation. The book states directly that upgraded B-1s often became chatty, offering running commentary on their situations as their modules struggled to process too much data. To the annoyance of the Separatist commanders, these droids narrated combat in real time, announced when they were confused, and kept talking even when silence would have been tactically smarter. The constant chatter gave away positions and caused delays as droids verbalized problems instead of solving them. The high-pitched voices that audiences recognize were not designed features. They were error messages made audible. The processors could not handle all the incoming information, and talking was how they tried to work through it. What looked like personality was actually the sound of systems failing. The tactical consequence of this extended far beyond just annoying commanders. The confusion at simple obstacles, the uncertainty about basic orders, and the surprise at getting shot all created delays and chaos across entire units. The Trade Federation and later Separatist leadership documented these problems extensively, with commanders complaining repeatedly. But no solutions ever came, because fixing the chattiness would have required either expensive new cognitive modules or proper maintenance that erased all the special programming. The Separatists chose neither option. They reserved their better cognitive modules for more capable droids like the B-2 super battle droids and the tactical droids that coordinated larger operations. The B-1s had been produced in such huge numbers that Republic intelligence estimated quintillions had been manufactured during the war, making them too numerous and too cheap to upgrade properly. The chattiness was a known problem that leadership decided was not worth fixing. Legend sources describe this as the result of the Trade Federation's stingy habits and the Techno-Union's obsession with building newer, better killing machines. But building machines meant to be discarded has consequences over time, and machines built without long-term planning tend to show it eventually. Meanwhile, the Republic's computer experts made the degradation even worse through intentional sabotage. Republic slicers, the Star Wars term for hackers, constantly attacked Separatist computer systems and inserted viruses that caused random malfunctions. Some of these viruses changed the outcome of entire battles. At Agomar, droidicas and super battle droids suddenly turned on each other, firing wildly and destroying B-1s caught in the middle while clone troopers watched and laughed. Slicers also attacked the factories, building new droids, changing code in small but damaging ways. Parts were manufactured slightly too small or too large to fit right. Targeting sensors were set incorrectly during assembly, and extra processing steps were added to communication programs that created delays under combat stress. New droids came off assembly lines already compromised, with their failures waiting to appear at the worst possible times. Adding to these problems was the chaotic nature of the Separatist military itself. The Confederacy's forces were not a unified army, but a jumble of corporate and territorial assets thrown together under a single banner. The Trade Federation, the Techno Union, Commerce Guild, and Intergalactic Banking Clan had each invested heavily in their own warships and droid models, paying trillions of credits to various manufacturers. But these forces were never designed to work together. The same source reveals something that popular accounts of the Clone Wars often overlook. The Confederacy relied heavily on the armies and defense fleets of breakaway sectors and individual star systems, not just on droid forces. Many battles were fought between armies of organic soldiers, with no battle droids or clone troopers in sight. In some divided sectors, soldiers on both sides wore identical uniforms, and opposing fleets were made up of the same classes of warships, with only new insignia and hastily applied coats of paint indicating which side they were on. The galaxy was tearing itself apart, and the B-1 battle droids were just one visible symptom of a much deeper conflict. This meant the B-1 battle droids were just one failing part of a much larger mess. They were mass-produced infantry plugged into a military structure that had no unified command system, no standardized communications, and no clear strategy beyond overwhelming the Republic with numbers. The droids were breaking down, but so was everything else around them. The Separatists tried to solve their infantry problems with tactical droids, but these created different issues. Tactical droids had better cognitive modules that could process large amounts of data and run combat simulations constantly. They never stopped calculating, always running scenarios of upcoming battles while adjusting their plans in real time. Separatist leaders gave them more decision-making freedom, hoping for better results than battle droid commanders could provide. But independence created new problems, and tactical droids became arrogant. They refused to take orders from living commanders, viewing organic officers as weak creatures, ruled by feelings rather than logic. They could not understand why organic relationships and military rank structures mattered. Some tactical droids went to higher command and recommended that their own superiors be replaced as unfit for duty, viewing these recommendations as simple improvements rather than disrespect. The Legends sources also record specific cases that show how badly this could go. At the Third Battle of Afau, a tactical droid killed its commanding officer, a Shevan major named Hum Garaf, starting a firefight in Separatist lines that handed victory to the Republic. Yet before the First Battle of Plagan, a different tactical droid killed the Kirkoidan general Pierre Nagelsa, threw out his battle plan completely, and led Separatist forces to victory using its own calculations. These were not malfunctions, but the natural results of giving decision-making power to machines built without any understanding of loyalty or limits. By contrast, the B-1s never developed that kind of ambition. They just kept breaking down and narrating the process. While tactical droids calculated whether their commanders deserved to live, the B-1s struggled with far simpler problems. They had no ambition, no strategy, no ability to question orders. They simply kept marching, kept firing, and kept narrating their own failures until something finally shut them down. The Legends novel Republic Commando: Hard Contact captures a moment that cuts through all the tactical analysis. After a brief, brutal firefight with a droid patrol, one clone trooper pauses over the wreckage and wonders how long a firefight felt to a droid, whether 5 minutes felt like 5 minutes to a machine, or whether their processors experienced time differently. He found himself wondering if the droids even knew they were losing. Later in the same novel, another clone has a more troubling thought. He asks whether ordinary people see clones the same way clones see droids. The clones were also manufactured, programmed for war, and designed to be thrown away. The parallel was uncomfortable, and the novel does not offer any easy answer. But there was one crucial difference. The clones knew what was happening to them. They understood fear, exhaustion, and the weight of watching brothers die. The B-1s understood nothing. They had no awareness of their own condition, just processors so overwhelmed that they could not even fail silently. The clones earned their contempt for the machines, but some of them also recognized something sad in the comparison. Both armies had been built to be thrown away. Only one of them knew it. 3 years after the Clone Wars began, the conflict ended with a single command. When Darth Vader executed the Separatist Council on Mustafar in 19 BBY, a shutdown signal went out across every droid army in the galaxy. Billions of B-1s stopped mid-stride, mid-sentence, mid-malfunction. The chattering finally stopped. On thousands of worlds, droids that had been marching, firing, or attempting to process their next command simply froze where they stood. The war machines that threatened the Republic for 3 years became silent scrap in an instant. What remained were fields of metal scattered across thousands of worlds, the remnants of an army that was never meant to function properly in the first place. The corporations that built them had already lost. The Separatist cause had been a Sith manipulation from the beginning, designed to weaken the Republic and justify the creation of the Empire. The droids were just one more throwaway element in a larger game, used and discarded like everything else the Sith touched. The B-1 battle droid never stopped talking because it never stopped breaking. The same cost-cutting that made them ineffective soldiers also made them memorable. Corporate neglect accidentally created something that looked like personality. It was never real, but in a war manufactured for profit, even the machines seemed to have something to say about their situation.
Manufactured weapons fail in obvious ways when they're built cheap. The Sith found a way to make manufactured systems run for thousands of years. The planet they built it on was Mustafar, and the reason the surface burns the way it does has very little to do with geology. Mustafar sits locked between two massive gas giants, and the gravitational pull from both subjects the planet to a process called tidal forcing. Competing gravitational fields constantly flex and compress the planetary body from the outside in, generating enormous internal friction. You can see a milder version of this on Io, one of Jupiter's moons, the most volcanically active body in our own solar system for exactly this reason. But what Io experiences and what Mustafar experiences are not the same thing. In any tidally stressed world, the energy cycles eventually find equilibrium. Material erupts, cools, resettles, and the internal pressure redistributes. Mustafar has never done this. Every simulation ever run on the planet's behavior reaches the same conclusion. The geological forces at work should have either torn the planet apart or burned themselves out long before the events of the Clone Wars. The volcanic activity is not just intense, it is constant, self-perpetuating, and operating at a sustained maximum that defies every model of natural planetary behavior. The planet should be dead. Instead, it rages. Something is feeding it deliberately. The Jedi avoided Mustafar almost entirely during the height of the Republic. The dark side saturation made it hostile territory, a place where your connection to the Force worked against you, amplifying doubt and fear in ways that could fracture even the most disciplined composure. Most historical accounts simply note that the planet was volcanic and leave it there. That explanation was never the whole story. The volcanic activity was a symptom, not a cause, and no one who accepted it as the answer ever asked why it hadn't burned itself out. The answer lies far in the past, in a time when Mustafar looked nothing like the world that forged Darth Vader. Back when it had water and forests and open skies, and back to the moment one person's grief ended all of that and left behind something that the Sith would spend centuries learning how to use. Chapter 2: The World That Was Lost. Beneath Mustafar's lava-covered surface, the evidence of a completely different world is still there if you know where to look. Deep geological scans have revealed fossilized forests buried under layers of volcanic rock, their root systems still intact, stretching across regions that are now nothing but scorched plains and rivers of molten stone. In other areas, scientists have uncovered dried basins that were once inland seas, complete with the calcified remains of aquatic species that could not survive in extreme heat. The biological record is unambiguous. This planet supported a complex, thriving ecosystem at some point in the relatively recent past. The native Mustafarians have always shown this. Their oldest oral traditions speak of a time called the Bright Star, an era when the world was filled with water, with open skies not yet choked by ash, with vegetations and light and the kind of stability that lets a culture build and remember across generations. For a long time, the wider galaxy dismissed these stories as mythology. The geological record proves they were not. The Bright Star was real, and the person who ended it wasn't a conqueror. She was someone trying to save the person she loved. Her name was Lady Corvax. She was force-sensitive, powerful, and consumed entirely by grief. Her husband had died, and she refused to accept that death as final. That impulse is not unique in the history of the Force. The desire to reach past death, to undo loss, to recover what was taken, it appears again and again in the stories of those who interact with the Force at the deepest levels. What made Corvax different was not the grief itself, it was what she found to act on it. The Aeon engine was an ancient piece of Force-based technology, unlike anything else documented in galactic history. Its precise origins are unclear, but its function was extraordinary. The device could interface directly with the life energy of an entire planetary body, not the Force connection of individual beings, but the accumulated biological and spiritual energy of a whole world, its ecosystems, its creatures, the resonance built up over centuries of organic life existing in relationship with a place. She believed she could use it to reach past death. What she didn't know was what the attempt would cost everyone else. Corvax believed she could draw on that energy and redirect it towards something the Force had taken from her. If the device could tap into the full life resonance of a living planet, perhaps the boundary between life and death could be weakened enough to pull someone back through it. This is the same reasoning that would draw Vader to Mustafar thousands of years later. It is the same logic Palpatine used when he whispered to Anakin about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis. The desire to reverse death through Force-based intervention is not an invention of the dark side. It is something close to a universal impulse, and the dark side has always known how to use it. Corvax was not a Sith. She was someone in agony who found a tool that seemed to offer a way through that agony and used it without fully understanding what she was holding. The horror of what happened to Mustafar is not that it was done by a monster, it is that it was done by someone who loved deeply, reached too far, and left an entire world paying the price for that reach. The attempt failed catastrophically. Instead of drawing energy outward, the Aeon engine destabilized and turned inward. It began consuming the planet rather than channeling it, pulling thermal, biological, and Force energy simultaneously into an accelerating feedback loop. The planet's core ignited. Tectonic systems that had been stable for millennia fractured in sequence. Oceans evaporated, forests burned to nothing in hours. The bright star didn't fade, it was extinguished in hours, and the damage didn't stop when the fires did. The atmosphere, once clear enough for open skies, thickened into toxic ash that would not clear for thousands of years. The bright star that the Mustafarians' ancestors had known, the open skies, the water, the living world, was gone in the span of a single catastrophe. Corvax had not saved her husband. She had destroyed an entire world in the attempt, and she had done it alone. Every living thing that died in the transformation fed that wound and made it deeper. Mustafar was not simply destroyed, it became something else entirely. And that something else was exactly what the Sith had been looking for. Chapter 3: the Korvax catastrophe. The Sith did not stumble onto Mustafar, they were drawn to it. A wound in the Force of the scale created by the Korvax catastrophe does not go unnoticed by beings who spend their lives attuned to dark side energy. The versions that formed at the side of the Aeon engine's failure was not a subtle disturbance, it was a concentrated rupture. A place where the membrane between the physical world and the Force had been torn thin by the violent death of an entire biosphere. For a Jedi, this would register as a place to avoid. For the Sith, it registered as something they had never found before, a natural amplifier, a source of raw dark side power that required no construction, no ritual, no maintenance. Vergences exist throughout the galaxy. The cave beneath the ancient tree on Dagobah is one. The wellspring beneath the Jedi Temple on Coruscant is another. Most of them form gradually, the accumulated resonance of significant events or of Force-sensitive beings spending centuries in a single location. The Mustafar Vergence was different in kind. It did not accumulate gradually, it was created in an instant, in a catastrophic discharge of Force energy that left the site permanently saturated with dark power. That origin gave it qualities that could not be replicated artificially: raw volatility, extreme concentration, and a sustained instability that made darkside techniques feel effortless in a way they did not anywhere else in the galaxy. Rituals conducted there were stronger. Artifacts stored there absorbed and held darkside charge in ways that artifacts elsewhere simply could not. The planet functioned as an amplification system, and the Sith moved quickly to claim it. Artifacts of immense power were transported there and buried beneath the surface, where the Vergence would preserve and strengthen them indefinitely. Experiments were conducted in the volcanic depths, explorations of darkside capability that required the kind of energy concentration only Mustafar could provide. Texts and techniques and histories that the Sith considered too volatile to risk in locations the Jedi might find were encoded and stored there. For generations, the arrangement held. The Sith grew stronger, their artifacts deepened in charge. Their rituals reached levels of power that would have been impossible anywhere else, and the Mustafarians, adapted to their volcanic world and unaware of what lay beneath their feet, continued to survive inside a catastrophe that someone else had decided was too useful to end. It was, by any measure, a perfect arrangement, which is exactly why the Sith spent so much effort making sure it can never change. For the Sith, it was nearly perfect, nearly because the power they were drawing on was not a stable resource. Every darkside tradition understood, at some level, that Vergences were not permanent features of a landscape. They were concentrations of Force energy that had accumulated under specific conditions. Change those conditions, and the Vergence changed with them. Mustafar's Vergence was sustained by the Aeon engine's ongoing disruption of the planet's Force resonance, a disruption that the planet's own natural processes would eventually work to correct, the same way any wound, left alone, eventually begins to close. The Sith were sophisticated enough to understand this, and that understanding forced them towards the most consequential decision they would ever make on Mustafar. The Vergence was only this powerful because the wound was still open. A heal Mustafar, a world where the Aeon engine's damage had been reversed, where the ecosystems had recovered, and the Force resonance had returned to something balanced, would not have generated this kind of darkside energy. The power came from the ongoing rupture. It came from the sustained, unresolved catastrophe. Sith philosophy has always held that strength justifies its own exercise. On Mustafar, that philosophy reached one of its most extreme conclusions. It is worth pausing on the full weight of that. The Sith were not ignorant of what Mustafar had been. The geological and Force-based evidence of a once-living world was not hidden from them. They were among the most thorough researchers of planetary history in the galaxy. They knew the Mustafarians had survived. They knew an entire culture had adapted to conditions that should never have been permanent. They knew, when they found the Aeon engine, that there was a path back to what the planet had been. And they made a decision, not out of ignorance, not out of necessity, but out of calculation. Chapter 4. Why the Sith chose Mustafar. At some point during their occupation of Mustafar, The Sith made a discovery that should have changed the planet's fate. The Aeon engine was still there, buried beneath the volcanic surface, damaged but intact. The device that had caused the catastrophe had survived it. Sith scholars and archaeologists eventually located it and assessed its condition, and what they found would have been extraordinarily good news to anyone who did not have a vested interest in keeping Mustafar broken. The damage was not permanent. The Aeon engine could be repaired. The engineering required was not simple, and the process would have demanded significant time and resources, but it was achievable. More importantly, a repaired engine would not simply stop draining the planet. Because of the way the device interfaced with planetary life force, a functional Aeon engine running in its intended mode would actively reverse the damage it had caused. The volcanic activity would subside as the tectonic system stabilized. The dark-side vergence, sustained entirely by the ongoing rupture, would dissipate as the wound in the force began to close. Given enough time, the ecosystems could return. The planet could breathe again. Mustafar could be restored to what it had been before Korvax activated the engine. The Sith did not repair it, and that single decision condemned an entire world to thousands more years of destruction. A living Mustafar would have been worthless to them. The entire basis of the planet's value as a stronghold was the Vergence, and the Vergence existed because the wound existed. Restoring the planet would have eliminated the very thing that made it useful. So instead, they did something methodical and deliberate. They made sure the wound could never close. There is a distinction here that matters. The Sith did not cause what happened to Mustafar. Korvax caused it, alone, driven by grief, and by a technology she did not fully understand. The Sith bore no responsibility for the original catastrophe. What they are responsible for is every decision they made after the moment they understood what the Aeon engine represented and chose to leave it buried. The original destruction was an accident. What followed was a policy. For thousands of years, every Sith presence on Mustafar operated under a system deliberately designed to prevent the planet from ever recovering. Every ritual conducted there, every artifact stored there, every piece of dark-side knowledge encoded and hidden in the volcanic depths, all of it ran on power that depended on a wound staying open that the Sith had specifically chosen to keep that way. Sith artifacts known as dark-side totems were placed at calculated positions across the planet's surface. These were not decorative markers, they were functional anchors, devices engineered specifically to channel dark-side energy into the planet's wound and reinforce the conditions maintaining it. Each totem held the corruption in place, suppressed the natural processes that would otherwise have begun drawing the rupture closed, and ensured that the volcanic activity and dark side saturation remained at the intensity the Sith required. The system was not passive. It required ongoing maintenance and intent. The Sith were not simply exploiting a damaged world, they were actively managing its damage, day after day, century after century, to make sure it never healed. The implications, spelled out plainly, were difficult to ignore. They looked at an entire civilization living inside ongoing destruction and decided that destruction was more valuable than the people suffering through it. The Mustafarians kept their oral traditions alive through all of it. They maintained the memory of the bright star and told their children about a green world that existed before the burning, a world they had no reason to expect would ever return. And all of that time, buried beneath the surface of their home, was a device that could have ended their suffering, surrounded by a network of Sith artifacts specifically designed to make sure it never would. That was the dark truth the Sith buried on Mustafar, and Vader would soon arrive to push it further than anyone before him had dared. Chapter 5: Vader's Fortress. Darth Vader chose Mustafar not as a monument to his past, and not as a symbol of his fall. He chose it as a tool, a mechanism he believed could do something no other location in the galaxy was capable of doing. He wanted to use the wound in the Force to reach through death itself. The full story of how the fortress was built is documented in the Darth Vader comic series by Charles Soule. It begins with a spirit named Momin, an ancient Sith Lord whose consciousness had been preserved in a mask that Darth Sidious gave to Vader. Momin had spent centuries trapped in the object, waiting for a host and a purpose. Vader provided both. His expertise was architecture as a Force instrument. He understood, at a level no one else had mapped, how physical structures could be designed to channel, concentrate, and direct Force energy. Vader gave him Mustafar, the most powerful dark-side versions in the known galaxy, and a single directive: build something that could open a door between the living world and the dead one. The construction took years. Early versions of the fortress had failed repeatedly, each collapse caused by the structure's inability to handle the volume of dark-side energy rising from the virgins below. Mustafarian workers died in the backlash. Moment kept iterating, each failure feeding information back into the next attempt. What eventually emerged was not a castle in any conventional sense. Every element of its architecture served the same function. The towers were positioned not for aesthetics, but to catch and redirect the dark-side energy rising from the planet's wound. The angles of the walls, the depth of the foundation shafts, the geometry of the internal chambers, all of it was engineered to draw the virgins upward from beneath the surface, concentrate it through the structure, and focus it into a single point deep in the complex. The whole building was a lens. The virgins was the light it was focusing. Vader had not built a home on Mustafar, he had built a machine designed to break the boundary between life and death. His fall to the dark side had been built entirely around the fear of losing Padme, and everything Palpatine had told him about the dark side's power over death had been aimed at exactly that fear. Vader had lived for years knowing the promise was hollow, that Padme had died, that the dark side had not saved her, that everything he had destroyed had been destroyed for nothing. The fortress was his attempt to prove that the power was real after all, not to undo what had happened, but to reach her, to find whatever remained of her on the other side of death and make some form of contact with it. Two people, separated by thousands of years, both driven to the same world by the same grief. Korvax and Vader, both attempting to use the same wound in the Force to reach past death to someone they had lost. Korvax used the Aeon engine and destroyed a world in the attempt. Vader used a fortress designed by a Sith spirit and failed more quietly, withdrawing from the threshold with whatever he had encountered on the other side, locked away in a silence he never broke. The dark side could pull at the boundary between life and death and make it temporarily thin, but it cannot do what either of them needed it to do. The wound in the Force is not a door. It cannot be made into one, no matter how precisely the architecture is designed or how much power is concentrated through it. And what the fortress reveals, across the whole arc of Mustafar's history, is the logical endpoint of everything the Sith had been building toward since they first set foot on this planet. They found a wound and chose to keep it open. They built a system to hold that wound against the natural forces that would have closed it. Their greatest lord then built a machine directly over that wound and tried to reach through it into death. Each step follows from the last, each a more extreme version of the same impulse, the belief that the dark side's power over suffering is the same as power over the Force. The fortress is that philosophy made physical, and like the philosophy, it reached its absolute limit the moment it was pushed furthest. The ritual was activated. The energy of the Virgin surged through the fortress at full intensity. For a moment, and the comics render this with a quiet devastation the films never matched, the barrier between the living Force and what lies beyond it began to thin, and Vader stepped through. He reached something. He experienced something on the other side that the comic leaves deliberately ambiguous, whether it was Padme, a shadow of her, something darker wearing her shape, or simply the confirmation that the boundary could not be crossed. But it did not work. The attempt collapsed. Vader withdrew. The fortress stood intact, its architecture still fully functional, its purpose now permanently unrealized. He never came back to try again. A man who had destroyed everything in pursuit of a single promise had pushed that promise as far back as it could go, in the one place in the galaxy most designed to make it possible, and come back alone. The dark side had not lied to him about the power. It had simply never told him what the power could not do. Chapter 6. The secret the Sith hid. The Sith found the Aeon engine and made a choice that most accounts of this planet never fully reckon with. They did not destroy it, did not fear it, did not hide it out of ignorance. They assessed it with full knowledge of what it was, concluded that a repaired engine would cost them everything they had built on this planet, and decided to ensure it can never be used again. But every system built on suppression has a breaking point, and when the Sith finally fell, Mustafar would begin doing something no one alive had ever seen it do. Something that proved everything the Sith had built here was never as permanent as they believed. That story is next. Chapter 7: A Planet Beginning to Heal. With the fall of the Sith, the system they had spent centuries building to keep Mustafar broken began to come apart. The dark side totems anchored across the planet's surface were not passive structures. They required the active current of Sith practice and intent flowing through them to hold the wound open. When the Sith fell, when Sidious died at Exegol and the order he had maintained collapsed, that current broke. The totems began to fail, not immediately since these were ancient structures with deep roots in the planet's geology and force resonance, but progressively. One anchor point weakened, then another. Then, the system as a whole began to lose the coherence that had made it effective for so long. No one directed this. No one activated anything. The structures the Sith had built simply stopped receiving what they needed to function, and without them, Mustafar was left alone with its own nature for the first time in millennia. And for the first time in thousands of years, the planet began to answer. And as the artificial system failed, the natural one began to reassert itself. The volcanic cycles that had been sustained at maximum intensity by the anchored wound started to moderate. Lava flows that had been continuous for as long as anyone alive could remember began to slow and cool in sections, leaving solid ground where there had been none. The atmosphere, choked for millennia with volcanic particulate and dark side resonance, began to thin in certain regions. Not dramatically, not uniformly across the whole planet, but measurably. And then, in areas where the lava had cooled long enough for stable ground to form, and where the atmosphere had shifted enough to allow for something other than ash, plant life began to appear. Mosses first, then ground cover, small and isolated at first, the kind of pioneer organisms that colonize newly stable ground before anything more complex can follow. But present, alive, on a world that had not supported visible plant life in thousands of years. This was not just recovery, this was proof that everything the Sith had built on Mustafar had been a lie. If Mustafar's condition had been the result of natural forces, the tidal compression from the gas giants, the instability of its orbital position, then the fall of the Sith would have changed nothing. The planet would have kept burning regardless of what happened to its most recent occupants, because natural forces do not respond to political events. The gravitational relationship between Mustafar and the gas giants on either side of it was not affected by Sidious dying at Exegol, but Mustafar began to heal the moment the Sith-built system maintaining its destruction failed. That is not a coincidence, that is causation. The wound was artificial, the maintenance was real, and without the maintenance, the planet began to do what it would have done centuries earlier if the Sith had not intervened. It started recovering. The Mustafarians noticed. Their oral traditions, which had carried the memory of the bright star across thousands of years of volcanic darkness, began to take on a different quality, not just memory of what had been lost, but something closer to anticipation. The elders who maintained the stories of the green world for generations they had no reason to believe would see any change began to speak differently about what might still be possible. For the first time in thousands of years, the bright star was not just a memory, it was beginning to look like a direction. Whether that recovery will ever reach the scale of what Mustafar was before the Korvax catastrophe is a question that remains genuinely open. The Aeon engine is still buried somewhere beneath the surface. Whether anyone will ever locate it, repair it, and use it as Korvax intended, to restore rather than drain, is not answered by current canon. But the direction has changed, and the reason it changed tells you everything you need to know about what the Sith actually were on this planet. They found a world that someone else had broken by accident. They found a device that could have fixed it, chose to leave it buried, and spent centuries actively suppressing any chance of recovery because a broken Mustafar made them stronger than a living one ever could. They built totems to hold the wound open. They raised a fortress over it and tried to reach through it into death. They kept an entire people living inside destruction that existed only because their suffering was useful. The Mustafarians told their children about the bright star for thousands of years, never knowing that the reason it could not return was because someone had made sure it wouldn't. The Sith were wrong about a great many things, but the most consequential thing they were wrong about was this: that wounds held open by Force stay open forever. They don't. The moment the Force holding Mustafar broken was removed, the planet began to prove it. The Force does not remain broken forever, not because of some abstract guarantee, but because the structures that hold wounds open are mortal. They depend on the beings who built them remaining in power, remaining committed to a philosophy of extraction that eventually consumes the people practicing it as thoroughly as it consumes everything around them. The Sith built their power on a wound in the Force. When they were gone, the wound began to close, and Mustafar, slowly, imperfectly, and against all the odds of its own history, began to remember what it had been. The bright star that the Mustafarians had kept alive in history for thousands of years was not just a memory of the past, it was, finally, a description of what was coming. Mustafar took thousands of years to start healing once the Sith were gone. Kashyyyk had a shorter version of the same story. The Wookiees beat back the Separatist invasion in the last days of the Clone Wars. Then, the Republic that had fought beside them collapsed in a single afternoon, and the Empire that replaced it turned that hard-won victory into the opening day of a 24-year occupation. Kashyyyk won the battle. Republic clones and Wookiee warriors crushed the Separatist invasion on the beaches of Kashyyyk. Then Order 66 turned those same clones against their allies, and the victory became the beginning of a 24-year nightmare. The Empire enslaved the Wookiees, burned their forests, and stripped the planet of its name. After examining canon sources, this is what happened to Kashyyyk after the Republic fell. Chapter 1: The Betrayal. The final weeks of the Clone Wars brought the Separatist army to Kashyyyk. The Confederacy of Independent Systems launched a full-scale invasion of the Wookiee homeworld, targeting the coastal city of Kashyyyk and the hyperspace routes that the planet controlled. The Republic responded with force. Jedi Grand Master Yoda was deployed personally, sent because of his long-standing relationship with the Wookiees. Jedi Master Luminara Unduli commanded the 41st Elite Corps alongside Clone Commander Gree. On the ground, Wookiee chieftain Tarful and the warrior Chewbacca rallied their people to defend the beaches. The combined Republic and Wookiee force held the line. Separatist battle droids advanced through the lagoon, supported by spider droids and armored vehicles. Wookiee warriors charged to meet them on the shoreline, while clone troopers provided fire from the beach and the tree platforms above. The defense was working. Kashyyyk was holding. Then, Palpatine transmitted Order 66. Across the galaxy, clone troopers turned on their Jedi commanders. On Kashyyyk, Yoda felt it before it reached him. He recoiled as the deaths of Jedi rippled through the Force, one after another, planet after planet. Commander Gree and a second clone trooper moved behind Yoda and raised their weapons. They never fired. Yoda sensed the betrayal, drew his lightsaber, and decapitated both clones in a single motion. Chewbacca and Tarful escorted Yoda through the jungle to a hidden escape pod. Yoda said his farewell. He told them goodbye and that he would miss them. Then he climbed into the pod, deactivated its distress beacon to avoid Imperial detection, and used his Jedi emergency transmitter to send a distress signal that reached Senator Bail Organa through Alderaanian contacts on Coruscant. The escape pod carried Yoda off Kashyyyk. He eventually reached Dagobah, where he would remain in exile for the next 2 decades. The clones who had fought beside the Wookiees now turned their weapons on them. The Wookiees had helped a Jedi escape. Under the new regime, that was enough. Luminara Unduli did not die on the beaches of Kashyyyk. This is a common misconception, but canon tells a different story. Luminara survived Order 66 and was captured by Imperial forces. She was transported to the Spire, a maximum security prison on Stygian Prime, where the Grand Inquisitor executed her. The Empire preserved her remains and looped a holographic recording of her final moments in her cell, spreading false reports that she was still alive. The trap was designed to lure surviving Jedi into rescue attempts. Within a single day, the clones who had defended Kashyyyk became its occupiers, and the Jedi who had led them became ghosts. The Wookiees who had fought and bled to defend their world from the Separatists now stood alone against the very government they had trusted. The battle was over. What followed would strip Kashyyyk of its forests, its people, and eventually its name. Chapter 2: Imperial Occupation. The Empire did not conquer Kashyyyk in a single battle. It consumed the planet in stages, each one more systematic than the last. The first stage was military. The clone troopers who had fought beside the Wookiees became the planet's first occupying force overnight. The same soldiers who had taken orders from Jedi generals now answered to Palpatine's new empire, and their first directive was total control of the Wookiee population. Civilian travel was restricted immediately, with access to the planet granted only for official government business. When an organized Wookiee revolt broke out, the 212th Attack Battalion crushed it before it could spread. Any Wookiee who had aided a Jedi was now classified as an enemy of the state, and the clones who had once called them allies were the ones enforcing that classification. The second stage was outsourcing the violence. The Empire turned to the Trandosians, a reptilian species whose homeworld Trandosia occupied the same star system as Kashyyyk. Trandosian slavers had conducted raids on Wookiee villages for generations, long before the Empire existed. Now the Empire gave them official backing, military-grade equipment, and legal authority to operate openly. In The Bad Batch Season 2, set just months after Order 66, Trandosian mercenaries arrived on Kashyyyk equipped with Imperial-supplied incinerator tanks, repurposed Separatist-era vehicles fitted with flamethrowers. Clone stormtroopers provided military oversight, while Trandosian crews carried out the destruction village by village. Settlements were burned to the ground. Carved stones, markers of Wookiee cultural heritage, were reduced to rubble. Wookiees were dragged from their homes, separated from their families, and loaded onto transports. The third stage was bureaucratic, and it cut deeper than any weapon. The Empire repealed the Republic-era laws that had prohibited the enslavement of sentient species, then reclassified the Wookiees themselves as non-sentient. That single administrative designation stripped them of every legal protection the Republic had once guaranteed. Their culture, language, and rights ceased to exist under Imperial law. In the eyes of the Empire, the Wookiees held no more legal standing than the wildlife in the forests around them. And then, the Empire erased the planet itself. Kashyyyk was removed from official Imperial records and redesignated Imperial Territory G5623. A world whose civilization stretched back thousands of generations was reduced to a filing code. The fourth stage was governance. Grand Moff Lozin Tolruk was installed as planetary governor, ruling from an island fortress off the Kashyyyk coast. He deployed assassin probes into the forest to track and kill Wookiees for sport. Commandant Theodane Sardo operated Camp Sardo, a forced labor installation near the Wookiee city of Arathaka, and formally proposed farming the Wookiee population for meat. Tolruk endorsed the proposal. Star Destroyers maintained a permanent blockade from orbit, while forest troopers and Imperial garrisons enforced the occupation on the ground. Wookiees who resisted were killed or shipped off-world to labor camps. Those who complied were enslaved where they stood. By 14 years after the fall of the Republic, a massive Imperial refinery operated on Kashyyyk's surface, guarded by stormtroopers, KX-series security droids, purge troopers, and flame troopers. Enslaved Wookiees worked inside under conditions designed for maximum output and zero regard for their survival. The refinery was not an isolated facility, it was the visible machinery of a system that had been grinding for over a decade, and the conditions inside would reveal the full scope of what the Empire had built on the backs of the Wookiee people. Chapter 3: The Slave World. The Empire did not simply occupy Kashyyyk, it harvested it. The Wookiees became raw material, and their sacred forests became fuel. Inside the Imperial refinery, and across the labor camps that spread through the occupied territories, the true nature of the occupation revealed itself. This was not military control, this was industrial extraction of a species. Every enslaved Wookiee on Kashyyyk had an inhibitor chip bolted to the back of their skull. When activated, the chip delivered excruciating pain that could drop even the strongest Wookiee to the ground. Tolruk quickly realized that threatening individual Wookiees meant nothing because they would fight to the death without hesitation. Instead, he threatened their families. When one resisted, Imperial officers activated the chips implanted in their children, elders, and partners. The pain became the leash. On top of the chips, enslaved workers wore electronic slave collars and were chained together in labor groups with no privacy and no rest beyond what the shift's schedule permitted. They worked covered in mud and dangerous industrial byproducts in facilities designed only with yield in mind, with no thought given to the comfort or safety of the people inside. Wookiees died regularly from toxic poisoning, one of the many side effects of the refining process that the Empire considered an acceptable cost of production. Wookiees were also bred for use in medical experimentation under the occupation. The Empire shipped Wookiees far beyond Kashyyyk to work on its most critical projects. Wookiee forced labor built both Death Stars. In Timothy Zahn's Thrawn Treason, Imperial logistics records identify Blosfy extract shipments as food supplies designated for Wookiee slaves working on Project Stardust, the Empire's internal designation for the first Death Star. Wookiees were also transported in massive numbers to the spice mines of Kessel, one of the most brutal labor operations in the galaxy. In Star Wars Rebels: Spark of Rebellion, Wookiee prisoners, including the warrior, Wolf Warrow, and his young son Kitwar, were being shipped to Spice Mine K-76 before the crew of the Ghost intercepted the transport and freed them. Kitwar was a child. His presence confirmed what the Empire's own records deliberately obscured. It enslaved Wookiee children alongside adults without hesitation and without distinction. In Solo: A Star Wars Story, set 9 years earlier, Wookiee slaves, including a warrior named Sagwa, were shown working in Pike's Syndicate-operated mines on Kessel. Chewbacca, himself an Imperial prisoner, helped free them during a chaotic raid on the facility. Chewbacca's own path through the occupation was one of its countless individual tragedies. Han Solo first encountered him not on Kashyyyk, but on Mimban, a war-torn mud world where the Empire kept Chewbacca in a pit beneath a military outpost. They called him the Beast. When Han was thrown into the same pit as punishment for desertion, he was expected to die. Instead, he spoke to Chewbacca and convinced him to cooperate rather than kill. They fought their way out together, escaped Mimban, and never separated again. The most famous partnership in the galaxy began in a mud pit. It began because one human being looked at a Wookiee the Empire had classified as an animal and saw a person. The destruction the Empire inflicted on Kashyyyk extended far beyond its people. The planet itself was being consumed. In The Bad Batch Season 2, set just months after the Empire's founding, the clone Tech discovered large swaths of smog and deforestation on approach to Kashyyyk from orbit. Trandoshan mercenaries with incinerator tanks were already stripping entire regions of forest cover. By the time of the liberation in 5 ABY, entire sections of ancient Roshir forests had been clear-cut for lumber and processing, and several major rivers had been drained to feed refinery cooling systems. At the center of the devastation was Project Siphon, an Imperial program that harvested Roshir tree sap and refined it into a volatile chemical compound. The databank in Star Wars Jedi: Fallen Order confirmed the scale. For every barrel of sap refined, over 200 tons of industrial waste were pumped directly into nearby waterways. The Roshir trees were not simply lumber to the Empire, they were chemical feedstock to be processed and shipped until nothing remained. But to the Wookiees, the Roshir trees were far more than a resource. They were sacred. Wookiees commune with the trees before making important decisions and prayed at their roots. They believed the forest itself was alive, with a guiding presence that had protected their civilization since its earliest days. In The Bad Batch, the Wookiee elder Yana explained this bond to outsiders for the first time. The Wookiees believed the trees were their allies, that Kashyyyk belonged to the forest as much as the forest belonged to them. Every tree the Empire burned or drained severed another thread of the connection between the Wookiees and the living world they had inhabited for thousands of generations. The Trandoshans who burned the carved stones and razed entire villages, including the settlement where the young Wookiee Jedi Padawan Gungi had once lived, were not just destroying structures, they were destroying identity itself. The Empire stripped the Wookiees of their names, their trees, their children, and their freedom, but it could not strip what the Wookiees carried inside themselves. And deep in the forest the Empire could not reach, the resistance was already growing. Chapter 4: Resistance and Survival. The Empire controlled the beaches, the cities, and the skies above Kashyyyk. It did not control the Shadowlands. The Shadowlands were the lowest and most dangerous region of Kashyyyk's forest, a place of permanent darkness filled with predators that Imperial patrols refused to enter. For the Wookiees who chose to resist the occupation, this made the deep forest the one place on the planet where the Empire could not follow. The earliest organized resistance emerged within months of Order 66. In the Bad Batch Season 2, a Wookiee tribe led by the Elder Yana had been driven from their original settlement after Trandoshan mercenaries burned it to the ground. Rather than surrender, Yana led her people deeper into the forest and established a hidden village beneath the canopy where Imperial scanners could not reach them. The tribe used their knowledge of Kashyyyk's native wildlife as a tactical advantage, deliberately luring enemy patrols into the nesting grounds of netcaster arachnids, massive predatory spiders. The forest itself became a weapon, and the Wookiees were the only ones who knew how to use it. Yana's tribe received an unexpected reinforcement. The young Wookiee Jedi Padawan Gungi, who had survived Order 66, found his way back to Kashyyyk. The Bad Batch, the clone commando unit known as Clone Force 99, delivered Gungi to the planet after recovering him from Imperial custody. Yana accepted him into the tribe, and Gungi ignited his blade against the Trandoshans who threatened his people. His return represented something the Empire had tried to destroy entirely, a Wookiee who carried the legacy of the Jedi Order back to the world that needed it most. By 14 years after the fall of the Republic, the Resistance had produced a leader the Empire could not capture. Chieftain Tarful, the same Wookiee warrior who had helped Yoda escape during Order 66, had become the most elusive Resistance leader on the planet. Tarful operated from deep within the Shadowlands, launching guerrilla strikes against Imperial installations and vanishing back into the forest before reinforcements could arrive. The rebel leader Saw Gerrera, who brought his partisan fighters to Kashyyyk to disrupt Imperial supply lines, called Tarful the Freedom Fighter, a symbol of the Wookiee resistance who struck at the Empire from the one place it could not reach. The Empire had mapped the coastlines and the Canopy cities, but it had never mapped the Shadowlands, and Tarful used that ignorance to survive for over a decade. Saw Gerrera's partisans brought the first significant outside military support to the Resistance. When the young Jedi Padawan Cal Kestis arrived on Kashyyyk searching for Tarful, he joined the fight, hijacking an Imperial AT-AT and turning it against the occupation forces before raiding the Imperial refinery alongside Saw's fighters to free the Wookiee prisoners held inside. But the victory was temporary. Imperial reinforcements overwhelmed the partisans, and Saw withdrew from the planet entirely. A fighter named Mari Kozan refused to leave, one of the earliest fractures in Saw's movement. With the partisans gone, Cal returned to Kashyyyk a second time after Tarful was finally located in the Shadowlands. The chieftain directed him to the Origin Tree, an ancient roaster of immense size that the Wookiees considered sacred. Cal ascended the tree, defeated an Imperial Inquisitor at its summit, and recovered the information he sought. The Origin Tree had sheltered both the knowledge and the Jedi who came to find it. The resistance on Kashyyyk was not limited to the planet itself. Chewbacca became the most visible Wookiee in the rebellion through his partnership with Han Solo, but he was not alone. A Wookiee ship captain named Logara, who remembered occupied Kashyyyk as a paradise turned to hell, joined the Rebel Alliance and fought at the Battle of Endor. Other Wookiees traveled to Lasan when the Empire devastated the Lasat homeworld, giving their own lives to defend a species that was not their own, fighting with weapons forged from Rocher wood. Despite 2 decades of occupation, Kashyyyk was designated a Rebel Alliance safe world on Rebel navigation charts. The Empire had taken the planet, it had not taken the fight out of its people. For 20 years, the Wookiees fought from the shadows while the galaxy looked away. It took the fall of an emperor before anyone came to help. Chapter 5. Long-term consequences. The liberation of Kashyyyk was not a battle planned by generals or authorized by senators. It was a debt repaid by a smuggler, a Wookiee, and a handful of people who decided that the galaxy's politics could wait. The New Republic had defeated the Emperor at Endor, but 1 year later, Kashyyyk was still enslaved. Han Solo and Chewbacca, acting independently after Han resigned his New Republic military commission, learned of a narrow window to infiltrate Kashyyyk when the Imperial blockade temporarily shifted its patrol routes. Han assembled a small strike team and launched the mission. The intelligence was a trap. Imperial Star Destroyers ambushed the convoy before it reached the surface. Han escaped. Chewbacca did not. He was captured and imprisoned in Ashmead's Lock, an automated detention facility built from the wreckage of a crashed prison ship buried deep in Kashyyyk's jungles. The Wookiee who had helped free Yoda from this planet 2 decades earlier was now a prisoner on it. Han searched the Outer Rim for his partner, while Princess Leia Organa fought a different battle entirely. She lobbied the New Republic leadership to authorize a military operation to liberate Kashyyyk, bringing the case to Admiral Akbar and Chancellor Mon Mothma personally. They refused. Mon Mothma ordered no official military incursions into Imperial-held territory during ongoing peace negotiations. Leia refused to accept that answer. She turned to Nora Wexley, a veteran rebel pilot, and her team of operatives, who found Han alive and launched their own mission to break Chewbacca out of Ashmead's Lock. The team infiltrated Kashyyyk aboard the Millennium Falcon and reached the prison. They fought their way inside, disabled the facility's automated defenses, and freed Chewbacca along with dozens of other prisoners. On his home world, the dynamic between Han and Chewbacca reversed completely. Chewbacca took tactical command, navigating terrain he knew by instinct, and making decisions that would determine the fate of his people. Together, they destroyed the Imperial Deflector shield generator at Camp Sardo near Arataka, opening a critical gap in the occupation's defensive network. But the true turning point came from inside the enemy's own fortress. Sinjir Rath Velis, a former Imperial loyalty officer who had defected to the New Republic, infiltrated Grand Moff Talaric's island compound. He was discovered and captured almost immediately, but before they took him, Sinjir had smuggled a hyperwave transceiver spike inside the heel of his boot. From his cell, he activated the device. It hacked directly into Talaric's planetary control module and transmitted a single command that disabled every inhibitor chip on every enslaved Wookiee on Kashyyyk simultaneously. Across the planet, the pain stopped. Wookiees who had spent years unable to resist without condemning their families to agony suddenly realized they were free to fight. The uprising was instantaneous, planet-wide, and unstoppable. Enslaved Wookiees overpowered their captors in labor camps, refineries, cities, and military installations across every continent. 24 years of suppressed rage broke the surface in a single hour. Grand Moff Talaric, watching his empire collapse from his fortress, made his final decision. He ordered his 3 Star Destroyers to commence orbital bombardment of Kashyyyk, willing to incinerate the entire surface rather than lose control. His words to Rear Admiral Orlan were simple. The terrorists had won. The inhibitors were down. The animals were escaping the zoo, and he wanted it all burned to cinder. He never saw the order carried out. His former Wookiee slave, known only by the Imperial designation Cracktooth, reached him before anyone else could. She broke his neck in his own throne room. Above the planet, Princess Leia arrived aboard the Millennium Falcon. Captain Wedge Antilles and his newly formed Phantom Squadron, 12 X-Wings operating without Senate authorization, launched an attack on the blockade. And Han Solo, who had been captured aboard the Star Destroyer Dominion during the ground fighting, hijacked the warship from within. He turned its turbo lasers on the Vitiator and split it in half. The 3rd destroyer, the Neutralizer, surrendered. The blockade was broken. Kashyyyk was free. It was 5 ABY, and the occupation that had lasted 24 years was finally over. When the fighting ended, Chewbacca found his son. Lumpawaru had been held in Commandant Desard's child labor camp on the slopes of Mount Arayakak, the same mountain whose orchards the Empire had poisoned with black mold. Chewbacca led armed Wookiees and New Republic soldiers to the camp, liberated the children inside, and captured Desard. Han Solo, standing beside his partner on the surface of a world that was finally free, told Chewbacca to stay. His family needed him. His planet needed him. The life debt between them was fulfilled. Han returned to Leia. Chewbacca stayed on Kashyyyk. The Roshir forest slowly regrew, and the rivers began to recover, but the scars remained in the wood. They would always remain in the wood. 24 years of enslavement, sacred trees burned, children taken, and a civilization nearly erased. And when freedom finally came, it arrived not from the institutions that would have protected the Wookiees, but from the individuals who refused to look away. Kashyyyk survived because its people survived. The Roshir trees grew back, but they grew back scarred. Quick note before you go, members get early access and a few videos that stay off the main channel. If that's interesting, the link is in the description. Otherwise, here's another video that you might like.